So here we are. My NDA has expired and I can finally delve into what I witnessed at Volition 5 years ago. I know you've all been patiently waiting for this, so you can skip to this timestamp to dive right in. Though if you're willing to wait just a bit more, there's a few things I'd like to quickly address. Since my trip to the studio all those years ago, there's been nothing more I've wanted to discuss than what I saw that day. Though at the same time, some things have occurred which have made that discussion a bit difficult. With Mike Watson's untimely passing, explaining the last day I spent with him in person hasn't been exactly easy. He was a great man, an incredible friend, and a blessing to the community. I have the utmost respect for Mike, so I just want to state that I don't take this discussion lightly, but it would be impossible to describe the entire day without mentioning him. And of course, Volition's closure only makes his story all the more tragic. I only hope this video will somewhat redeem the developers who actually wanted to make a good game, and that you'll see how a studio could have the best intentions, just to have them squandered by incompetent people in power. Now, as for why this video took so long to make, there's quite a few factors. I think the most important thing to understand is that I simply don't want to cover just my eyewitness testimony. For you see, I pray I never have to talk about this game again, so I've spent a ridiculous amount of time reaching out to as many ex-Volition devs as possible. Hell, at one point I had to fly out for an in-person interview or two, but this was all crucial to explain the entire history of the Saints Row Reboot's development. So I've structured this video to go through my day at the studio, but I'll be pausing at key moments to provide information I learned years after the fact. With all that out of the way, let me show you the Saints Row we never got. It's 2019, roughly 2 years after the commercial failure that's Volition's last title, Agents of Mayhem. The Saints Row community is in deep speculation over the studio's future and what their next project could possibly be. Although it was safe to assume the next game would tie into the Saints Row brand in one way or another. A new IP would be far too risky, and Volition didn't have access to their older franchises like Red Faction until THQ Nordic purchased Koch Media in 2018. This is when I reached out to Volition's community developer Mike Watson to see if I could set up a time to visit the studio. See, every couple years I make my way out to Chicago for an event called G-Fest, an annual Godzilla convention. Since it's only a few hours drive from Volition's studio in Champaign, it's my only opportunity to go. Mike agreed to let me come down and even set a day aside just so he could show off their next project. This would be my second time visiting the company, the first being in 2016. That trip was more or less to get a full tour of their offices and to meet key people in every department. This time, however, Mike wanted to give me as much hands-on time with their new game as possible. A few months later, it's July 15th, 9 AM, the big day. I drove down from Chicago and met with Mike outside the studio. We catch up for a bit, but he didn't want to waste any time. So I'm quickly escorted upstairs through their lobby and into a meeting room. It's here Mike tells me to wait while he runs out to grab 2 surprise people. As I'm patiently waiting, the only thing in the room was a projector displaying a desktop screen. On the desktop was a Volition wallpaper and a single PDF file labeled Summoner 3. Now, if you're not aware, Summoner was a fantasy action role-playing series Volition developed 2 titles for in the early 2000s. This honestly threw me through a loop because absolutely no one could have predicted that Summoner of all games was something Volition would consider reviving. As I quietly panicked, Mike came back into the room with associate producer Kate Nelson. I've known Kate since 2015 when I had the opportunity to interview her, and we met in person during my first visit to the studio. She has always been very professional with a plethora of wild Volition stories, so it was nice to meet her again. However, the second person Mike brought in took me by complete surprise. The one and only Jim Boone. For a little context, Boone has been on and off with Volition for nearly 2 decades, primarily as a producer. From 2013 to 2015, he kind of became a notorious figure in the Saints Row community due to his prominence in their game's marketing. In the old Saints Core Discord server, he had a dedicated section for just fan art, so he kind of became a celebrity of sorts. So seeing him in person for the first time was quite shocking. As Kate and Boone took their seats around the table, Mike asked if I was curious about the Summoner 3 file on the screen. I admitted that it did catch my eye when suddenly everyone started laughing. As it turned out, this was just a prank that Mike set up. A pretty good one, I must admit, because in my mind, I saw the Saints Row franchise sinking like the Titanic. Before I could even sigh a breath of relief, Mike opened the file and it loaded an animated title card that said, Saints Row Sinko. Now, there's a chance you may have heard about this from leaks, but yes, that was the original title of the game. The animation showed a highly detailed belt buckle littered with silver guns, girls, and gang members. The best way I could describe it is if you combine the main menu of Saints Row the Third Remastered with the marble statue from the credits of Avengers Age of Ultron. It was pretty badass, and I was told later that the animation was going to serve as the game's main menu, but for whatever reason, we got this instead.
Fucking thing sucks!
Anyway, Kate began explaining exactly what I was about to witness. This was an investor's presentation designed to show the studio's vision to their publisher and to potential unaffiliated parties who may also want to back the game. And oh, don't worry, I'll be diving into development costs for this game later. Mike clicked to the next panel, which showed a screenshot of a black truck on the edge of a valley overlooking a sunset. I will say, graphically, I was quite surprised by how well it looked. This is when Boone stepped in to explain exactly what the game is. Row Sinko was meant to be a clean slate. No more wacky or over-the-top elements like demons or aliens. They wanted to go back and rebuild a foundation where gangs were your top priority and rising from the ground up was your main motive. At the same time, they didn't want to alienate their newer audience, so the 2080 rule was born. The tone of the game was going to be 80% Saints Row 2 and 20% Saints Row the Third. This meant the story would still be serious in nature, but it allowed for occasional absurd moments, though there wouldn't be anything extreme enough to take away from the experience. So far, I was fully vibing with the concept, but that's when Boone described the setting. Our game takes place in the desert city of Santo Ileso. A desert? Of all the locations to set a Saints Row game, a desert never even crossed my mind. I was feeling a bit skeptical at this point, and as if Mike sensed this, he assured me that I'd feel different once I got a better look at the city. The next few panels consisted of concept art of Santo Ileso. I learned about locations like Old Town, Rancho Providencia, and especially El Dorado. Having Las Vegas as its direct inspiration, I couldn't help but think of Las Venturas from San Andreas. Boone went on to explain that they didn't want Santo Ileso to just be a backdrop for gang warfare. They wanted the city to have its own rich history and the feeling that reflected the series as a whole. So they came up with the concept of the Weird West. Inspired by Austin and Portland and their motto of keeping their respective cities weird, KISS, Keep It Strange Santo, became a jumping off point to flood the world with unusual sights, sounds, and people. The next few panels reflected this with an array of concept art showing sculptures, Santo citizens, and murals. Seeing all this was a huge positive. A very common complaint for the later Saints Row games was the lack of detail the city Steelport had compared to Stillwater. It really seemed like the studio took the criticism to heart and wanted Santo Ileso to push the limit of what they accomplished in the past. Boone then explained that the studio had spent the last 2 years rebuilding their Agents of Mayhem engine to run features Saints Row fans would expect, such as customization, co-op, and activities. By the time the engine was finished, it was roughly 80% rebuilt from the ground up. I'll have more to say about the engine once we get further along. Anyway, this is when things got real. Kate Nelson pulled out a wireless Xbox controller and Mike loaded up a program on the computer. Boone explained that what I was about to see is a vertical slice of the game. A vertical slice, for those who are unaware, is a fully functioning but small section of a video game made early in development to demonstrate how the full experience will come across. That's probably an oversimplification, but just know a vertical slice is vital for studios and their publisher to see what they're capable of achieving. As the game was loading, Boone went into detail of how this was their most sophisticated vertical slice to date. Instead of the art, narrative, and development teams working separately before merging their works like previous vertical slices, this time every team worked holistically to develop something that could be carried over into the full game. Now, I'm not a game developer, but something about Boone's explanation didn't sit well with me. Compared to their previous vertical slices, what was described seemed counterintuitive to what the studio's been refining over the last decade. In an odd way, it kinda just sounded like they bypassed the vertical slice phase and just started work on the full game. Before I could think about it further, the game finally loaded. It started on a black screen. All you can hear is shovels digging and 2 muffled voices in the distance. A lower third text appears saying Volition presents as the scene opens to a cutscene of a van in the desert. We then see 2 gang members with shovels unearthing a hole with presumably the boss beaten unconscious on the ground. They finish digging and drag the boss over to bury the player alive. Okay, from everything I've seen so far, this was the moment I knew I was on board with the game. Starting with the reversal of one of the most iconic moments from Saints Row 2, you son of a bitch, I'm in. I mean, they completely blew this in the final game, but we'll talk about that later. And since I know a lot of people will be asking, no, this wasn't the same boss used in the marketing. In fact, from all the gameplay I would later see, nothing had her. Just as the 2 gang members are about to place the boss in the open ditch, a generic saint off-screen shoots the 2 men and proceeds to help the boss back to his feet. The saint explains that your lieutenant was also kidnapped and you have to save them. The cutscene ends with the boss brushing himself off as the saint drives off in search of reinforcements. From here, Kate takes control of the game and pans the player's camera around the environment. She describes that the current mission takes place towards the middle of the story. The 2 men who attempted to kill the boss were from a gang known as the Idols, an anarchist cult with the desire to destroy the establishment of the Western world. Now okay, I'm sure that doesn't sound much different from the Idols we see in the final game, but oh boy, trust me, they changed a lot. Something I quickly noticed was the HUD. It was a little more sterile compared to the previous games, but there was still a hint of that Saints Row flair. It was unquestionably better than the HUD we'd eventually get that may as well be the digital equivalent of watered-down tofu. But back to the gameplay, Kate walked to a nearby gas station and showed off one of the game's new features, dumpster diving. She explained that this was just a small example of the exploration reward system they were implementing, and that I would learn more about it as the presentation unfolded. Though for now, Kate interacts with the dumpster and a music sting plays that's a reference to Link collecting items in the Legend of Zelda games.
Jackpot.
It was decided later that they wouldn't use the sting, but it was kept as an Easter egg for this one dumpster present in the vertical slice. After opening the dumpster, the boss earned a small amount of XP. Kate explained that their approach to leveling up was a bit different this time around. There was 3 separate skill trees: muscle, wealth, and fame. Each tree served to mirror the core characteristics of each rival gang and would level up respectively from the player's actions. XP earned from combat would go into muscle. Stunts, challenges, and wearing stylish clothes would level up fame, and increasing your gang's income would progress the wealth branch. Hearing this gave me heavy Sleeping Dogs and Crackdown vibes, but I was quite intrigued. Every level would unlock a new perk, but I would get a better look at this later in the presentation. And with that, Kate said the boss needed to get cleaned up before pursuing the kidnappers and walked over to an outdoor clothing kiosk. This was my first look at the game's customization, and I have to say, I was speechless. There's been a lot of debate on whether or not the reboot had the best customization in the series, but goddamn it was almost undeniably the case. First, I was shown right away that both layered clothing and socks made a return. Considering that the last time these features were present in a Saints Row game was back in 2009, I was ecstatic to see them again. But that was just the beginning. There was the new RGB slider, of course, which was wild to see for the first time, but on top of that, style menus for clothes were back better than ever. You could choose a wide variety of fabric for your clothes. Leathers, cotton, furs, reptile skins. It was freaking impressive. I would learn much later that these options were removed due to memory limitations, and as a result, we were left with these. For the sake of the presentation, Kate was also able to customize her boss's physical appearance at the kiosk, and once again I was blown away. Instead of the sliders from previous entries, each facial option opened a grid with an adjustable point for more in-depth alterations. If you've ever seen APB Reloaded's player customization, it was just like that. Why didn't this make it into the full game? Well, again, memory became a big issue. You'll be hearing that a lot in this video, by the way, and it caused countless issues with facial animations. This is also why presets became so prominent. Kate finishes customizing her character by making the boss a blonde female. And since I know a lot of people will be wondering, yes, the player customization did have selectable genders at this point. Kate proceeds to search the gas station for a vehicle and shows off that the Bodukin from the 3rd has made a return. It's from this point the boss gets a phone call to check out the Snake Oil Saloon on the rim of town to get answers on the kidnapped lieutenant from an idol member named Billy. On the drive, Kate makes sure to show off the surroundings of the desert. Considering that the last 2 installments took place in the dreary Steelport, I was honestly impressed by the new environment. I still wasn't sold on the idea of the game taking place in a desert, but I was still surprised by the detail. I would learn years later that the creative director, Brian Trafficante, came from an environmental artist background and really pushed to make the world look as breathtaking as possible. Though some devs have argued that his attention on the art distracted him from other aspects of the game that needed more focus. It is a Saints Row game after all, and not a scenery simulator. The next events that occur in the presentation may seem familiar to those who have played the Kevin rescue mission. This was in fact reworked to what's seen in the final game, but there's still some major differences. Kate briefly shows off the Welcome to Santo Ileso sign before walking into the saloon where a cutscene plays. It's the same cutscene seen in the full release, but instead of the boss saying, "Where the fuck is Kevin?" they instead say, "Where the fuck is Pierce?" That's right, at this point in the game's development, the original Saints were in the reboot. I'll be delving more into that in a bit. You can believe that. Also, I should quickly mention that all the voice acting up to this point was temp audio. None of the voice actors for the boss were hired for the game yet. After the cutscene, the mission plays out quite similar to the final, where the boss slams an idol into a jukebox and an all-out brawl engulfs the bar. The melee combat, on the other hand, was fairly different. The best way to describe it is that it was a hodgepodge of the previous game's mechanics. It had the 3rd's aimless swinging, but also had Saints Row 2's system, where 2 consecutive hits resulted in the 3rd being a takedown. So I wasn't overly impressed by the melee, but it was certainly a step in the right direction. So why did it come out like crap in the final product? I'll explain that a bit later. Once Kate finished the brawl, another cutscene loaded, showing one of Billy's underlings running outside before panning to an idle specialist jumping down from atop a train cart. Unlike the specialist design Volition eventually settled on, the one here was unrecognizable. They were shirtless, wearing a Deadmau5-esque neon-lit dome for a helmet, and carrying an electric selfie stick sledgehammer. Yeah, not gonna lie, I was given Instant Decker and Watch Dogs default PTSD seeing this. I only prayed that the other two gangs held up that 2080 rule. Once the cutscene ended, more idle members arrived and a firefight broke out, showing the first real look at the gunplay. Kate immediately took one of the idols as a human shield. Yes, that feature was going to be in the game. I learned much later that Deep Silver felt it was too violent, so it was removed. So yeah, thanks Deep Silver. Thanks for removing one of the most iconic features in the series because you felt it was a little too graphic for an M-rated title. You clowns. The reason Kate took a human shield right away was to show off an early perk you unlock by leveling up the muscle skill tree. It was an ability that put a live grenade down an enemy's pants before throwing them. This did somewhat make it into the full game, just without the human shield element. Mike explained that these abilities could be toggled and were interchangeable as you unlocked them, so I thought that was pretty cool. Up to this point, I was thrilled with probably 90% of everything shown, but now I was about to see my biggest gripe. Each idle member Kate would shoot would enter this dazed stance with a large yellow icon over their head. As it was explained to me, the big idea for this game's combat was to feel like a total badass. Essentially, Volition wanted the player to feel like John Wick. So, you wouldn't be able to recover health like in previous games, but instead you would damage an enemy until they entered a stun animation where you could then perform a takedown to receive a quarter of health. To me, this was utterly moronic. Of all the changes from the vertical slice to the final game, removing this mechanic had to be the best improvement. Now don't get me wrong, the reboot's combat is still abysmal for a caveat of reasons, but replacing the stun feature in favor of a takedown meter was a positive. Besides that, the gunplay seemed sound, enemies reacted well to damage, and didn't come across too bullet spongy. I think I was mostly thankful not to see the twirl reaction that was infuriating in the last two games. I wouldn't notice the real problems until getting hands-on later. After Kate cleared out the regular idols, she pointed her attention to the specialist. His attacks were simple enough, just a lot of ground slams with an electric pulse. She made quick work of him before running over to a porta-john where the idol's member from before was hiding. The screen transitions to a cutscene of the boss yelling at the idol member to get out, and when they refuse, the boss proceeds to hook the porta-potty up to a car with the tether. Mike explained that the tether was a new mechanic in which cars and aircrafts could use a steel cable to pull large objects at will. I'm not gonna lie, I was ecstatic to see this. Sure, Grand Theft Auto dabbled with the concept, but the only games I can think of that really went all in were Just Cause and Mercenaries 2. The very thought of a Saints Row game having this feature had my mind racing, especially considering all the possibilities in co-op. The next segment of the presentation plays out essentially to what's in the full game, with the boss interrogating the idol member by driving the porta-potty through the gang's encampment. Eventually, the idol member tells the boss that Billy's in a hot air balloon out in the desert. Hot air balloons, I hear you ask? Yeah, they were gonna be a big element of the open world, which sounded pretty cool. I tried to find out why they were removed, but sadly, I never got a solid answer. A brief chase through the desert occurs as we finally reach the climax of the mission where the boss finds Billy's hot air balloon. Thankfully, the segment has actually been shared online, so it'll be easier to explain. The boss uses a ramp to get airborne and deploys a wingsuit to reach Billy. I was fairly thrown off seeing the wingsuit for the first time. Actually, my first thought was that people would start calling Saints Row a Just Cause clone. Mike explained that the wingsuit was their 2080 solution for newer fans who love Saints Row 4's superpowers. I mean, it seemed like the most logical compromise, but I don't know. Can't beat a solid parachute in my opinion. So, the boss glides Billy's hot air balloon and a complex QuickTime event commences. Volition initially planned to have a considerable amount of QTEs in the game, but apparently it got so ridiculous at one point that they toned it down to just 5 in the release game. Anyway, the boss struggles with Billy during the QTE, ending with the hot air balloon on the verge of combusting just as the player escapes Billy's grasp. The screen fades to white and the mission essentially ends. It's explained to me that the full mission would have a section where Pierce is rescued, but for the sake of the presentation, it jumps ahead to the boss in a truck and a rescued Pierce outside the New Saints Church. As for Pierce's design, I unfortunately didn't get the best look since he was standing a distance away from the boss, though it appeared to be an updated look of his design from the third. When I asked around years later, I was told it was most likely his model from Saints Row 4, but updated for the new engine. Anyhow, Kate explains this final portion of the mission was designed specifically for the presentation to show off a new feature. Pierce thanks the boss for saving them, and I know what you're wondering. No, he didn't have a temp voice in place, it was the one and only Arif S. Kinchin. He would be one of the very few voice actors to nearly complete all their voice lines before the old Saints were cut from the story. However, I was told much later that Volition still wanted him to be a part of the game. He was nearly a DJ at one point, then a building manager, an idols boss, though unfortunately the timing never worked out. There is a chance he voiced a random pedestrian, but I couldn't confirm this. At the very least, some of his original voice lines could still be found in the game's files, like this radio ad found by Mega Freeman.
What up, Santo Ileso? This is Pierce Washington coming to you with an announcement of a lifetime. Planet Saints has opened its first branch in your historic city. So show us some high-key love and come get your wardrobe turned with us. We've got the threads that'll give you that snatch look you've been dreaming of. Hashtag Saints Love, hashtag Hot AF, hashtag Workin' Hunty, hashtag Yes Bitch, hashtag FOMO, hashtag Saints Row Bitches.
Anyway, Pierce thanks the boss, then explains it's time to take real control of the city. He requests for the player to pull out their phone to access an app. This was the first appearance of the phone's UI, and I have to say, it was a stark difference compared to what's in the final. It had an unmistakable resemblance to the phone in Watch Dogs 2 to the point that I seriously considered if they copied it. There were also additional apps that took up enough space to fill 2 screen pages. I asked about these later and learned most were temp icons for cut features like a selfie mode. Unlike the selfie mode that was added later to the game, this one would have been more traditional with the boss physically holding the phone to take pictures. There was another app that was a store page, but I'll get back to that one. Though the one difference in the phone's UI that still pisses me off is the fact the screen displayed the time of day. This isn't in the final game. I mean, it made sense to remove it from the third since the time of day was set, but now you have a damn day and night cycle. Don't you think that's an important detail for the player to see? It was right there! And don't tell me it would have muddled up the UI or some bullshit. If you look at the model of the phone in the open world, it has the fucking time! Look at it! What the fuck?! Okay, sorry, I just had to get that out of my system. So Kate pulls out the player's phone and opens an app to a new gameplay mechanic known as Criminal Ventures. In the final game, we know the Criminal Ventures more or less became a replacement for activities, but originally they're gonna be something far more ambitious. As Mike explained it, the Ventures served as a customization option for the city itself. For every district taken from a rival gang, you could place a business in the newly acquired territory that would offer unique missions and income. However, these businesses would range from over-the-top to more grounded illegal endeavors, giving the player full control of the tone of their own gameplay experience. After hearing this, I thought it was simply genius. It would appease both old and new school fans by allowing them to mold the game based off what they love from the series. I would eventually see all the criminal ventures they had planned, but the first 2 examples I was given was the Brighter Future Waste Disposal and Planet Saints. Unlike the Brighter Future we got in the final game where you would collect waste trucks and take them to the disposal plant, here you would take the trucks from the facility and dump the radioactive material in various locations around the map. Occasionally, police and environmentalists would attempt to stop you, upping the risk of the barrels being damaged. Why was this changed to a grueling drive through the entire city without any obstacles? I have no idea. As for Planet Saints, the venture was formerly going to serve as both a store and the Saints Tower. The idea was that you could place multiple Planet Saints around the map to resupply your weapons, take an aircraft, or wingsuit from the top. Kate also emphasized that each criminal venture offered unique rewards. Planet Saints was going to be a security style for the gang. Though an element of the ventures that really intrigued me was that each business would have a direct effect on the district it was placed in. The waste plant, for example, pedestrians that spawned around it would be mutants. I'm talking extra limbs, grotesque blemishes, and enlarged features. The inspiration came from the riffs in Saints Row 4. I thought the idea was hilarious, so you can imagine my surprise when in the full release, we got this.
Must destroy mankind. Ooh, lunchtime.
There is a reason this was heavily downgraded, but it has to do with one last feature that would have tied into the criminal ventures, simply known as Proclamations. Originally a cut concept from Agents of Mayhem, Proclamations allowed the player to declare a new law in any Saints-controlled district. These would have ranged from allowing pedestrians to streak freely, wearing furry costumes, to pimps and hoes roaming a district unopposed. Though my personal favorite was going to be Wild West standoffs. If you angered a pedestrian, they could challenge you to a pistol duel. This would play out with a QuickTime event where you had to shoot the pedestrian first or die instantly. One other proclamation I was told about, which nearly became its own feature, would have allowed you to record your voice with a microphone for pedestrians to repeat in a friend's game. You could have created an entire library ranging from generic civilian lines to reactions being attacked. As absurd as it already sounds, I can't even begin to imagine how abused this system would have been.
Do you think there's Aisha Rule 34?
This was one of the few proclamations that was fully finished too, but Deep Silver cut it to undoubtedly avoid all the controversy that would have come from it. But okay, you might be wondering what this has to do with the criminal ventures. Well, it was gonna be a hybrid system. Since each venture had an effect on the district, it in turn directly altered the proclamation. Say the Wayside example where NPCs turn into mutants. With the proclamations, imagine mutant hoes, furries, or streakers. And bear in mind, this wasn't just an optional feature, it would have provided hundreds of possibilities for the player to experiment with. Unfortunately, I learned years later that only 5 proclamations were ever fully finished before the entire concept was scrapped due to the scale of the feature. As for the criminal ventures, I'll provide more details on that soon enough. Back to the presentation, Pierce gives a rundown on how the criminal ventures work and the mission at last ends. This wasn't the end of the gameplay portion, however. The player is then loaded into the Saints HQ. Its appearance was slightly different from the final. The back was slightly smaller, the bar was missing, and had rows of church pews. I was told that during this portion of the story, the HQ was yet to be remodeled. Like Purgatory and Saints Row 2, the HQ would evolve with each takedown of a rival gang. However, there was one significant difference, as I would soon see. First though, Kate walks over to a player customization icon in the corner. This is when Boone tells me they decided to remove plastic surgeons from the game in favor of all player customization being done at the HQ. I'll admit, it hurt to hear such an iconic staple of the series not making a return. Hell, they originally intended to bring barbershops back from Saints Row 1. To some degree, I understood making this change for player convenience, but on the other hand, you lose all the fun of roaming the city that make your ideal character. So you could imagine my surprise when they streamlined player customization even further by making it a fucking app on the phone. Alright, so Kate shows off a bit more customization. Nothing new that I haven't mentioned before, just a more in-depth look at clothing and style options. After Kate put on some new threads and exited the menu, she walked over to another icon to customize the HQ. Now, if you've ever played the game Scarface the World Is Yours and tried out the Pimp My Mansion feature, this was nearly identical. A grid appeared along the ground where you could place and angle props anywhere. One item in particular Kate showed off was the porta potty from the rescue mission. She explained that new items could either be found in the open world or unlocked through activities, challenges, and missions. They also plan to make a furniture store where cosmetics for the HQ could be purchased as well. That store app I mentioned earlier would have also served as a way to buy props. This is when I asked if the same level of customization would be available for cribs as well, and I was told, yes. I couldn't put into words how I felt in this moment. Crib customization has been one of the most fan-requested features to return, and not only did they listen, it was coming back with a force no one could have even dreamed of. So you could imagine how pissed I was to see the feature butchered in the final release and for cribs to be removed altogether. And don't you dare tell me that apartment counts as a crib. That shit's only around for like 4 missions before you lose access to it. Okay, so like me, you probably want to know what the hell happened. Well, there's quite a few factors, but it mostly came down to get your shot glass ready, memory limitations, and difficulty with the engine. Anyway, Kate places a couple items around the HQ and says it's time to check out the city. Before that though, she walks over to the porta potty she placed and you can hear the idol member from the mission crying inside.
Open up and I swear I'll leave you alone.
To pick up the pace of the presentation, Kate used the console command to warp from the HQ to the entertainment street in the Old Town district. At this point in development, Old Town was the only district that was presentable. If I remember correctly, it was between 80 to 90% finished. Once Kate spawned in, she casually walked around to show off the environment and the pet density. I will say, it was clear this was the most lively city Volition has made since Saints Row 2 Stillwater. Pedestrians were playing music, dancing, drinking, purchasing food. You really got a sense that this was a living and breathing world. There was even a mariachi band playing. This is when Mike told me he was working on getting a mariachi version of Aha's Take On Me in the game since it was his favorite song from Saints Row 2. Sadly, with how long music rights take to acquire, it never happened. After a quick stroll, Kate did something that genuinely made me gasp. She walked over to a taco truck and ordered a spicy burrito. I thought to myself, at long last, after years of fan cries, we finally have consumables back. But then something else happened. Eating the burrito triggered a hidden diversion and the text Human Torch appeared on the screen. Okay, so Human Torch was a concept for an activity that was conceived during Saints Row 2's development. The player would catch on fire and your objective was to burn as many pedestrians as possible under a time limit. However, its gameplay wasn't exactly thrilling enough to be its own activity, so it eventually evolved into the trailblazing we know today. So to bring back Human Torch as a hidden diversion? That was such an insane deep cut that this was truly the moment I felt Saints Row was back. As Kate showed off Human Torch, Mike explained that Volition knew players enjoyed being rewarded for going off the beaten path when exploring the map. It's a big reason why Saints Row 2 got so much praise for their elaborate Easter eggs in the iconic Hidden Julius mission. So, as part of the previously mentioned reward system for exploration, they intended to hide diversions, Easter eggs, and cosmetics in every nook and cranny of the map. I was beyond thrilled to hear this. For the first time in nearly a decade, it felt like the studio was truly listening to the fans. After a minute or so, Kate completes the diversion and makes her way over to an old military fort. Mike then explains that the studio has spent the last few years creating centuries worth of lore for Santo Ileso, and the example here is Fort Colon. Kate walks over to a historic marker that plays a narrated description of the fort's history and the general who operated there. It's explained to me that these markers tie directly into their philosophy for rewarding exploration. By carefully listening to each marker at these historic sites, the player can use that newly obtained knowledge to find hidden goods. As Kate walks to each marker, they tell a story of the general finding gold and hiding it prior to dying in battle. However, there's one clue that describes exposed bricks on the fortress that may have been caused by the attack. Kate proceeds to walk over to the wall of the exposed brick and fires a rocket at it, revealing the hidden gold within. The gold is then unlocked as a new HQ cosmetic. Honestly, I thought this was amazing. The fact players would have only stumbled upon these rewards by freely roaming with no incentive would have vastly increased the game's replayability and strengthened the world's charm. It almost seemed too good to be true, which it would eventually be the case. It was told to me sometime after the game's launch that publishers hate when development time is spent on features a majority of players would never see. So these historic sites were turned into the hidden history side objective you see in the final game, completely killing its allure and turning the whole concept into a tedious scavenger hunt. Hell, not even listening to the markers would lead to hidden treasures anymore. The gold from Fort Colon? Yeah, that just became an Easter egg unrelated to the location's history. On a side note, the narrator for the markers was only temp at this time, and Mike was curious if I'd be willing to lend my voice for all the historic sites. I immediately agreed and hopped into their audio booth right then and there. I'm kidding, by the way. But there's a lot of people who believe I really am the narrator. Even before the game's release, an insider told Flippy that it was me, so I don't know if my mannerisms were an inspiration or what, but I just want to set the record straight that I am not the narrator. I'm not. Stop it. Did you know? Anyway, with all that, the gameplay showcase was finally over. Though there was one final goodie to top off the presentation, which was a minute-long internal trailer. It mostly consisted of combat and car chases, but it did show a mission that would have taken place around the beginning of Act 2. This would have been a wingsuit race that took place over a Hoover-inspired dam. In the footage, the player bounced off the top of hot air balloons to gain altitude and flew through burning rings for a speed boost. It really gave off sky-blazing vibes from Saints Row III's Murder Brawl DLC, except the pace was much faster. By the way, the mission was fully finished and playable, but a higher-up decided to cut it for some godforsaken reason, and the dam was significantly downgraded. The trailer ends with a shot of the boss flying over the dam as explosions and fireworks go off all around them. Though, after fading to black, there was one last quick scene of a furry dressed as a coyote chasing another furry dressed as a roadrunner. A little nod to the Looney Tunes cartoon Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner. And yeah, with the presentation over, everyone was curious to know my thoughts. I know we've been jumping back and forth quite a bit between what was cut or changed, but bear in mind, the entire presentation was roughly 40 minutes long. There was so much info to process that all I could really say is that the game looked amazing, and it seemed like they really attempted to check off nearly every fan request for the last 8 years. Boone agreed and went in depth on their goals to appease all corners of the fandom. He then gave an example of weapon concepts and judging if they fit into the 2080 rule. One was a reference to the Lazarus gun from Mike Watson's Gentleman of the Row mod for Saints Row 2. When firing the weapon at an enemy, they'd be stricken down by a lightning bolt from the gods. For Saints Row Sinko, instead of a lightning bolt, a large cloud would form over the selected target and God's foot would come down and crush them. Quite the wild idea, but obviously it was far too ridiculous to fit Sinko's tone. Another such idea was a new version of the Penetrator. This was actually an idea from Saints Row modder F13 who casually mentioned the concept to Mike, and he liked it enough for it to be designed and tested. Unlike the Penetrator you're likely familiar with, this one would start flaccid, but with each kill, it would become more, erect. Once it was fully aroused, fireballs would be launched from the tip. Another humorous idea, but again, it was just too much. One final example that almost made it into the game but was deemed too graphic was a portable wood chipper. The weapon would suck up nearby NPCs and launch their shredded flesh out the back. Frankly, I loved this concept and suggested they reconsider cutting it. Before I could be asked anything else, I happened to mention that I was surprised to see Arif doing voice work so early for something like the vertical slice. There was a brief pause where everyone looked at each other, then I was told it was a recent decision to cut the old Saints from the game in favor of a new cast. So Saints Row Sinko was gonna be a full reboot. Honestly, I didn't know what to feel hearing this. On one hand, the old Saint's story was told. Sure, the story fell off a goddamn ledge, but it was told nonetheless. I've personally never been on board with reboots where it's simply the same cast with just a slightly altered story. Though if this game was say a retcon of a previous title, absolutely keep that in mind by the way, then there'd be no question to keep the old crew. On the other hand, would the game really be Saints Row without the likes of Shandy, Gat, and Pierce? Well, it turns out, yes. Yes, it wouldn't be Saints Row at all. If I had known that these were the characters that were going to replace the old cast, I would have jumped over that table and throttled Boone till I was dragged out of the studio kicking and screaming. At the time though, there was one aspect that had me especially conflicted about losing the old cast, but to explain that, we need to jump back a year. Just to be clear for a second, Mike Watson was someone who took the studio's secrecy with the utmost importance. He would never tell a soul outside Volition his work if it meant the slightest chance the company could be compromised. Even after my visit and being under an NDA, Mike refused to discuss the game in any real detail in case my account was hacked and our DMs leaked. So just know that Mike took the most care of anyone I know not to share any sensitive information. Well, that is except one time. In May of 2018, Mike got assigned to something big. Something so big that he couldn't help but tell me. Keep this on the down low, but I'm designing a mission for our new game. I'm the perfect guy to do it, considering it's something that desperately needs to be resolved. Even though he kept things fairly vague, anyone who knew Mike knew exactly what he was talking about. Dex. Dex has been one of the biggest unresolved plotlines in the entire series, and Mike wanted more than anything to finally conclude it. He first tried back in 2014 during Gat Outta Hell's development after convincing Steve Jarus that the character needed a resolution. However, he was mortified to see Dex treated as nothing more than a lazily put together Hitman diversion. So this was finally his moment to give the fans the real closure they always wanted. Mike confirmed all this with me later that day, but I'll get more into the story later. Getting back on track, Kate and Boone had a lot more questions for me, but Mike suggested we go out to lunch first, so I had some time to digest everything I've seen so far. We all agreed and walked over to a restaurant across the street. For the next half hour, we had a casual discussion. I explained my history with the series, Kate told some behind-the-scenes stories at the studio, and Boone discussed coming back to Volition after Agents of Mayhem. Sometime after our food arrived, Boone asked me the big question. How do you feel the fans will react to the old Saints not appearing in the game? It was quite the loaded question. Without having seen anything for the new characters, I simply said it'd be a hard sell. A Saints Row game without the likes of Johnny Gat is like having a Halo game without Master Chief. It can be done, sure, but to win over the fan base, the new cast has some seriously large shoes to fill. And as we'd find out, they couldn't even open the shoe if it had Velcro straps.
Fuck it.
I was then asked how I'd handle any references or Easter eggs to the old Saints in the reboot. Being on the spot, only a few ideas came to mind. I suggested a couple things like a newspaper headline saying that gang warfare is rising in Stillwater with a picture of the old Saints. My other idea was pamphlets for Shandy's talk show being scattered around the city, or possibly an old man NPC who looks suspiciously like Johnny Gat. He could be found working in a random store and mumbling angry references to characters or events from the series. We talked a bit longer, but Mike knew that time was of the essence and there was still so much more to show. So he told Kate and Boone we'd meet back up later, and I went back with Mike to his office. It was approaching time to finally get hands-on with the reboot, but first Mike wanted to show a few things he had saved on his computer. He started with a huge collection of concept art for the game. First was art for Santo Ileso and the planned districts around the city. Mike made sure to emphasize that Volition was well aware of the criticisms for Steelport's lifeless industrial design, and they're focusing on creating a thriving world closer to Stillwater. And I can say that's one of the few things they got absolutely right. If it wasn't for the lack of interiors, Santo Ileso would be a contender for the best map in the series. For the most part, all the art I was shown of the city did make it into the game, but there were a few exceptions. The desert regions were originally going to be much larger and far more distinct. As Mike explained it, each individual desert had an environmental level that ranged from normal, medium, to beautiful. Normal is your typical desert, very barren with very little vegetation. The mediums level art had a notable increase in flora, but the beautiful level was truly exotic. The artwork showed waterfalls, rivers, colorful flowers, and a wide range of cacti and trees. Seeing this started to open me up a bit more to the whole desert idea. I would learn much later that they prioritized fleshing out the city, so the deserts were significantly decreased and less work went into giving each region its own identity. Don't get me wrong though, the deserts still look pretty damn good in the full game, but ultimately they fall short of what was planned. Next was UI art for skill perks in the new respect system. There were roughly 10 perks per branch, but some additional skills could be unlocked exclusively through the criminal ventures. One notable perk for fame was called Golden Guns. It was a reference to a cheat with the same name where any gun would instant kill opponents. The perk though was simply a weapon upgrade for homies and recruited followers. I also noticed that one final skill perk in the money branch was a face of Genki. I unfortunately never found out what this ability had. The only other perk I was told about was a boost for the wingsuit. It would have been unlocked through completing a diversion called Kaijuice. Yes, Kaijuice was eventually turned into a side hustle for the Heist and Hazardous expansion, but initially it was going to be a diversion that would be unlocked through the Planet Saints venture. Next was 2 perk icons for vehicles. The whole idea for signature abilities wasn't fleshed out yet, but Mike explained that these were just going to be upgrades you could unlock and then place on any vehicle like kneecappers or nitrous in the previous games. One of the icons was for an ejector seat to make a quick getaway with the wingsuit, and the other was called the J-turn. This would have been a perk to flip your vehicle 180 degrees, but it eventually evolved into one of the other signature abilities in the full game. Moving past the perks, Mike pulled up artwork for the gangs. Seeing the idols earlier, I was very curious to see how the other rival factions were handled, and the first did not disappoint: the Panteros. How Mike described them to me, Volition wanted to take the raw, ruthless force of the Brotherhood and combined it with the cold but precise criminal dominance of the Carnales. I was beyond stoked to hear this. The art didn't disappoint either. I saw absolute units covered in tribal and scarified tattoos, wrapped in chains, and wielding an assortment of melee-based weapons. There was also some art of their vehicles, the Scorpio factory hideout, and the forge. As for their arsenal, everything I saw did make it into the game except for one weapon called the plate launcher. It loaded weights from a barbell to be projected at targets. Even though it was cut, the concept later evolved into the Pain and Gain for the Heist and Hazardous DLC. From all the Pantero art up to this point, there's one thing that stood out in retrospect. Among the concept art of the Panteros members was Nina. Mike didn't mention anything about her when presenting all this to me, so I can only guess that her art was originally made for a generic female member of the gang before it was recycled for Nina's base design later on. I attempted to get confirmation on this, but no one with insight on the matter was able to tell me. Anyway, Mike then showed artwork of the Panteros leader, Sergio. He looked fairly similar to what's in the full game, but there were some alternate outfits like a couple business suits and one where his shirt was white instead of black. Alongside Sergio, there was also art for his right-hand lieutenant. I cannot for the life of me remember his name, but I learned much later that his character didn't make it far before being cut. Mike explained that he's Sergio's brother. As for his appearance, he was slightly heavier than Sergio and wore a white blazer with a black shirt. Next up was art for the idols. This is when I got a much better understanding for what the gang was all about. Essentially, the idols were a fraternity turned cult controlled by 2 siblings with a philosophy they are reborn Egyptian pharaohs. A sister named Lonnie and a brother named Donnie. Okay, hold up, this wasn't gonna be our Donnie. The idea was considered early on, but they ultimately decided to make him a whole new character, but kept the same name with a different spelling. There was one large aspect for both characters that I was told, and it was gonna be heavily implied that the two were in an incestual relationship. Yeah. From what I was told a lot later, it was a single writer who pushed for this crucial aspect of the siblings before they are abruptly blacklisted from the industry for things that I cannot and will not discuss here. It was after this that the 2 characters were cut and replaced with the collective scene in the game. As weird as it would have been, I still would have preferred Donnie and Lonnie over the 6 idol collective leaders. Like, you feel nothing taking these guys out. Hell, I bet you can't even name a single one of them. Did you know this guy's name is William? See, me either, because I just made it up. Fuck you, William. As for Lonnie and Donnie's designs, they couldn't help but remind me of the Calypso twins from Borderlands 3, except that they are remade in a Sims game. When in combat, they'd wear a mask of a Sphinx and Anubis. I really like the idea of ancient Egypt being rooted in the idol's ideology. There has always been undertones of ancient Greece and Rome throughout the series, so I felt there's a lot of potential to tap into here. Moving right along, the next collection of art was for the Saints. I didn't see anything for the old or new cast, just simply designs for the standard crew. Some concepts were for unlockable styles like the Planet Saints bodyguards, while the rest were just Volition narrowing down the gang's final look. A few really fed into the 2080 rule, while the rest looked more in line with what a gangster would wear in a blistering desert. Though there was one piece of art for the Saints that really stood out, which was a border collie wearing a purple bandana. Mike explained they wanted to add the first ever quadruped homie to the game that would also serve as the gang's mascot. The dog was also going to be customizable. You would have been able to choose its breed, alter the color of its fur, and select cosmetic items like a bandana. It seemed like a cool idea, so you're probably wondering why we ended up with this instead. See, Volition's difficulty with quadruped NPCs can be traced all the way back to Saints Row III. Each time they attempted it, they just couldn't get it right, and as I would learn a few years later, they had the same problem here. So, their solution was to swap out the dog with a cat you would only ever see in cutscenes. Though what's even more painful is that 2 weeks after this decision, a developer was finally able to crack functioning quadrupeds in the open world. It was apparently too late to course correct, so instead of wasting the work, they added in coyote NPCs. Getting back on track, Mike moved on to artwork for the last rival gang, and you could probably guess who they were. Yep, the Ultor Corporation. Wait, what? Yeah, so originally Ultor was going to be one of the 3 main gangs in the game. Though it was decided at some point that a faction the player has already fought in the past wouldn't be as interesting. So Ultor was changed to Masako Multinational. Unlike the Masako units we're accustomed to, they had more of a private security look. Honestly, it reminded me of the Agency, an unused gang concept for Saints Row III. The color orange was dropped in favor of green so the gang would fit into the whole muscle, wealth, and fame idea. Masako Multinational would get far enough along in development that you can actually find some models for them in the game's files. Though it was eventually decided the concept wasn't working. So taking inspiration from the 2080 rule, they took 80% of Ultor, combined them with 20% of Stag, threw in a little country twang, and the Marshals were born. For Marshals art, it's clear their design stayed fairly close to what's seen in the game. For their vehicles, I was surprised to see that the VTOL and the Spectre were making a return. Mike explained they're being reworked to be less sci-fi and functioned off more plausible real-life tech, which for the most part did happen, but not really. The Spectre, though, was heavily redesigned after my visit into the MDI-707B and the craft lost its ability to hover at any height. For the Marshal leaders, Atticus and Myra Starr were there from the start, but the head of the company was instead Atticus's brother, Gideon. I must say, there was a lot of sibling reworks throughout the game's development. Gideon would have been more prominent in the second act of the story before being ousted from the company and losing all his assets. There would have even been a hidden diversion you would unlock where you can find Gideon as a homeless man living under an overpass. The diversion was called Hobo Juice, where you could purchase a bottle of mysterious liquor from Gideon, and drinking it would cause a player to pass out and wake up in a random location around the map. If you ever drank too much alcohol in the Ballad of Gay Tony, the system would have been nearly identical. This was a fully completed feature, by the way. Even after Gideon was cut, the original plan was to replace him with Atticus if you chose the option to fire him. But of course, this became one of numerous cut features due to poor management from incompetent higher-ups. Anyway, I should also mention that Gwen had some concept art too, but her character went through a lot of variations during development. This was mostly due to the story constantly evolving, but for a while she was actually going to join the Saints near the end of the game. That probably sounds absurd, but it'll make more sense once I delve into the story. Alright, after seeing the gangs, it was time to see art for one of the new Saints. See, even though a new main cast was a recent idea, there was one character that was planned from nearly the very beginning, Nuwali. As Mike explained them to me, Nuwali was essentially going to be Gat 2.0, a stoic badass who would have earned the trust of the Saints early on in the story and assisted them in conquering the city. You would have formed a strong camaraderie with Nuwali, making it all the more tragic when he betrays you. There wasn't any of this, "Oh, I don't have any friends, so I'm going to take yours" bullshit. He wanted to take over the Saints by killing you and your lieutenants. Some of the best plot points in the series came from betrayal, so I was completely on board with this. Of all the characters, Nuwali probably went through the most radical alterations. His earlier designs made him come across as a serial killer. Jesus Christ. This was heavily toned down to make him becoming an ally of the Saints more believable. I should also mention that Nuwali didn't have his own faction at this time. I was told later that this concept didn't stick around long, but during my visit, he was actually a lieutenant for the Panteros. I promise that'll make sense in a few minutes. So okay, after seeing all the concept art, Mike pulled up an outline for every mission in the game. This is when I was told the entire story for Saints Row Sinko. But first, we need to jump back to 2017 when the game entered full production. Having seen how over the top the series had become, Volition knew it was time to pull things back. So, the writers decided to retcon Saints Row 4 entirely and softly retcon the third so Johnny Gat was still alive. The inciting incident was never fully settled on, but for whatever reason, the boss, Shandi, Gat, and Pierce would leave Steelport and start a war with the rival factions of Santo Ileso. The gangs hadn't yet been fully realized during this phase of development, but the archetypes for the Marshals, Panteros, and Idols were there. Throughout the story, certain moments would mirror what's seen in the full game, but there was some major differences. At one point, the Saints would purchase a nuke off the black market just for one of the rival factions to steal it. Plus, as a first in the series, the Saints would make a brief alliance with the Idols to finish off the Panteros. The train heist scene in the full game was actually reworked from this script, where Sergio was stealing Marshal goods as the Saints and Idols ambushed and killed him. After nearly a year of fleshing things out, in May of 2018, Mike would be given the task to direct his own mission where the player would finally be able to kill Dex. The level wasn't going to be critical to the main plot, it would have been hidden just like Revelation and Saints Row 2. Everything up to this point was moving fairly smoothly, but things would quickly change. Now, I just quickly want to say that I've given Deep Silver a lot of flack over the years, and I'd say 90% of it was completely justified. I mean, just look what they attempted to do with Time Splitters. You stupid cocksuckers. But I have to say, I was wrong about them being the main villain in the fall of Saints Row. 3 months prior to Mike being assigned to the Dex mission, THQ Nordic had purchased Deep Silver and gained full say over the publisher and its subsidiaries. After some time, they looked at the story for the game and flat out rejected it. Volition, understandably taken aback by this, had no choice but to take THQ's notes and rework the story. In the second script, the old Saints were still front and center, Santo Ileso was still the setting, and Dex still had a planned mission. Though there was one big change, and that was the introduction of the boss's mother. Okay, bear with me here because things get a whole lot weirder. The mom would have been a customizable character with a short list of presets, and her plot revolved around marrying a new husband, John Bland. John was a real estate agent turned mayor, and he would have been voiced by the late Bob Saget.
Oh, Bob Saget!
His character would have been a blend of Richard Hughes and Dane Vogel, a corrupt politician secretly working with the factions of the city. Throughout the story, there'd be moments where the boss interacted with Bland, and they'd play up the whole son-hating stepdad trope.
You keep your liver-spotted hands off my beautiful mother, she's a saint!
In the game's climax, the Saints would crash a massive parade being held in Bland's honor. The boss would find him on one of the floats, but this wasn't any ordinary float. On top was a massive mechanical gorilla that would have served as the game's final boss. I'll just let that image set in. This all came from 8 revisions of the original story. I was even told in one of the earlier drafts that the boss would have killed Bland in a retirement home on his birthday.
Was that me or was that you?
I'm kinda getting the vibe that one of the writers had some serious family issues. There was even talks of having Bob Saget play himself instead of John Bland, but that idea maybe lasted a total of 2 afternoon meetings. Funny enough, John Bland is in the full game, but his character is so forgettable you may not have realized it. He's the realtor you threatened to get the church and the lots for the criminal ventures. Look, there he goes! Whee! So yeah, things got a little odd, but overall the essence of Saints Row is still present. The second draft was submitted to THQ Nordic, and they rejected it once again. Panicked at this point, Jim Boone believed the only way to convince Nordic to approve the story was to hire someone who's previously written the older games in the series. So a decision was made, a decision to bring back Steve Jarus. Yep, that's right, the man responsible for all the previous Saints Row titles was back at the helm. I just want to quickly mention that I was completely oblivious to all this till years later. Not even Mike Watson told me about Jarus. Even the other writers were left in the dark at the time until they came back from a Christmas vacation and discovered he had already rewritten the entire story. Due to Jarus' contract, his word became gospel. Not only did he have full say on every aspect of the story, the other writers weren't allowed to criticize his decisions or even speak to him. The higher-ups at Volition refused to let the writing team contest any of Jarus' ideas, and they were told to simply flesh them out. It was Steve's decision to make the story a reboot, and THQ Nordic finally approved the concept. From there, the script molded into what I saw during my visit. This is the story as it was written in late 2019. Instead of the cold opening of the boss being buried alive and sparking a whole whodunit mystery, the game began with the Marshal's recruitment video. It then pulls back to reveal the player as a Marshal soldier riding in a helicopter, preparing to bust a Pantero's drug deal in the desert. Following the previous game's jump-in approach, the player would have been completely covered head to toe in armor to be customized later. Gwen deploys you and her team mid-air, immediately introducing the player to the wingsuit mechanic. The team eventually squads up with ground troops and they take on the Panteros. Both Sergio and his lieutenant Nuwali are overseeing the deal, but Sergio allows Nuwali to be captured in order to escape. You stop Nuwali and the scene transitions to the player in a locker room where you're then able to customize your character. Instead of all the performance bonus bullshit, the player simply drives off to their apartment. Prior to the new cast, the player's roommates were Johnny, Aisha, Pierce, and Shondi. I never got clarification on which gangs they were all affiliated with prior to forming the Saints, but I know Gat was with the Idols and Aisha was a DJ. The student loans aspect wasn't yet present, so the story jumped immediately to the Mad Max-inspired chase in the desert instead of the Loan Shark mission. The Panteros convoy is stopped, and the Hummingbird Codex, oh boy, that damn Codex, is found among all the drug paraphernalia. The player is then ordered by Atticus to run protection for the Codex at the History Museum, where it's later stolen by the Idols. Atticus fires you, and after a montage of moping around the apartment, the player gets everyone together as they decide to form the Saints. They find and claim the church as their own before the boss performs public stunts to get the attention of possible recruits. A similar beat does occur in the full game where the boss participates in Doc Ketchum's murder circus, but that wasn't the case originally. The boss would have instead performed in a Mario-inspired go-kart race through the city for the publicity and to win the deeds to the criminal venture lots. The level would have also ended with the boss interrogating someone, possibly John Bland, inside a coffin tethered to a vehicle in a graveyard. This mission was fully completed, by the way, but the coffin interrogation was deemed too dark and the go-kart race was cut altogether. Only a remnant of the race could be seen in one of the wanted target levels, though I was told the race alone was 20 minutes long, so it might be for the best it was removed. After officially getting the gang off the ground, the idols would get a whiff of their presence. Donnie and Lonnie would order some idol troops out of the boss and Pierce captured. This was the same mission from the vertical slice that eventually morphed into Kevin's rescue in the full game. After the failed kidnapping attempt, the boss retaliates by participating in a wingsuit race held by Donnie and Lonnie during an event known as Idol Fest. The boss wins, resulting in the idols losing their sponsors and inspiring more people to join the Saints. It's from this point the crew decides they need to find someone with more experience running a gang, so the boss determines they need to break Nawali out of the Marshall's Frontier prison. The mission would have played out similar to what's in the full game, except there are plans to have an extensive cutscene with Nawali taking out an entire corridor of Marshall troops with a single knife. It was intended to show just how viable and threatening he truly was. After the prison break, Nawali agrees to help the boss under the condition he would get revenge against Sergio. Nawali then teaches the crew the ropes and helps them take a solid piece of the city as their own. As all this is going on, the Panteros start to hammer down on the idols as tension between Atticus and his brother Gideon rises. The idols eventually become so weakened by the Panteros' constant barrage that they have no choice but to approach the Saints for an alliance. The Saints agree and the two gangs form a plan to kill Sergio during a heist on a Marshall-controlled train. In preparation, there would have been a mission where the boss would steal Marshall Spectres. The whole business training crap in the full game was not here. When the time comes, the Saints, Idols, Panteros, and Marshalls have an all-out battle as Sergio attempts to escape. I just want to mention that I was shown a previs of this level when Mike was explaining all this to me, and I will say the original plan was bonkers. Since the Spectre hadn't yet been turned into the MDI 7075, there was going to be a scripted segment where you would have flown all around the train, going above, flying below bridges, all while keeping your eye on Sergio with sharp cinematic zooms. The Spectre would eventually get shot down at one point, forcing the boss to land on a neighboring train and proceeding to drive a Marshall truck along it to jump back over to the main one. The boss would then hijack a Marshall tank to catch up to the cart where Sergio was holding out. I should mention this is where Sound of the Police was originally intended to play instead of the Lone Shark level in the full game. The mission would reach its climax with one of the Idol twins killing Sergio and the entire train being derailed. The alliance between the Saints and Idols is over, and Atticus uses the loss of the train to get Gideon kicked from the company. Not allowing the Idols to fully recover, the Saints target the gang until finally Donnie and Lonnie are killed. The Mockingbird Codex is found among their things and is reclaimed by the boss. I wasn't exactly told how the mission would play out, but I know the Idols yacht was an idea that came much later, so defeating the twins here and getting back the Hummingbird Codex would have played out very differently than the events in the final game. But okay, you probably want to know what the whole purpose of the Codex was. Besides being a MacGuffin for the player to get fired from Marshall, it would have actually been a map to a hidden treasure that all the gangs wanted. Once you obtain the Codex and follow its clues, you'd be led out to the middle of the desert where you'd unlock endgame content. What was this endgame content, you might ask? Well, approaching the location on foot would cause a massive pink pyramid with Genki's face on it to rise out of the ground. Inside would be columns of letters and numbers. There was a planned system where codes could be randomly generated around the map. By finding and entering these codes in the pyramid, you would unlock cheats. And this wasn't just an idea, the pyramid existed in the game. I saw it with my own two eyes. Like, imagine if the giant cabin in Saints Row 2 wasn't just an Easter egg, but it also unlocked a whole new gameplay mechanic. It was that fucking cool! Every cheat you found and unlocked could then be activated in New Game Plus. Oh yeah, New Game Plus was a thing too. I was sadly never told why it was cut. But yeah, they had one of the coolest implementations for cheats I've ever seen, just for cheats to get cut altogether. If you ever wondered why I got so pissed off that there wasn't cheats in the game, it was because of this. Yes, cheats were added later, but it wasn't even in the same realm of what they originally had planned. Back to the story, with just Marshall and the Saints left in the city, it became an all-out war for dominance. This is when Myra Starr plays her hand. She reaches out to the boss with information to defeat Atticus from the inside. First, she informs the boss that Gwen is secretly a LARPer and that she can be blackmailed into helping them. Okay, so the live-action role-playing concept came from a cut DLC for Agents of Mayhem. The whole joke was that the LARPers would use Nerf weapons to attack you while you just blew them away with real guns.
You have live rounds when you're playing. Yeah, that's the joke.
They would have only appeared for a single mission and it was going to be played as a complete joke. Though I was told a lot later that a lot of people from Volition are actually fans of LARPing and they felt this game could be their chance to popularize it. Well, that didn't fucking happen. So we got 4 godforsaken LARPing levels instead of this. Man, I still can't believe that Sunset Overdrive handled this idea better.
I must grant you a boon.
Alright, so the boss would have massacred their way through a bunch of nerds to reach Gwen, and after threatening to expose her, she grudgingly agrees to help. She discloses the location of a Marshall's weapon depot hidden near the dam scene in the Idlefest mission. This location was essentially the Marshall version of the pyramid from Saints Row 2, but not as high-tech. I got to see an unfinished version of it, and it shared many similarities with the terrorist bunker in Saints Row 4's prologue. Anywho, the boss destroys the depot, and Atticus fires Gwen for allowing it to happen. Though knowing Gwen was an efficient officer, the boss asks if she wants to join the Saints, and she accepts. Myra continues to provide information to the Saints until the boss is finally able to make Atticus look incompetent enough to get voted out of the company. Myra would then take his position. I was told she was going to be even more threatening than Atticus, but it was kind of left up in the air if she continued the fight or allowed the Saints to take the rest of the city. Though this concept art implies their last meeting didn't end on the best terms. And at last, we reach the ending. Mike explained that the details of the final mission were still being worked out, but basically, Nawali would meet with the boss in a non-disclosed location before revealing his plan to kill you and your lieutenants to take full control of the Saints. Nawali would then either drug or knock the boss out, placing you in a realm between life and death. I was flat out told this was going to be Volition's version of the Voss dream fight from Far Cry 3. I thought it was a little unusual, but it seemed like it could have been pretty interesting. I learned a lot later that the sequence was originally going to begin with the boss waking up in a large river that ended at a white door. As the player would walk towards it, you would hear Orville Peck's Old River playing alongside echoes of the Saints. Opening the door led to your final confrontation with Nawali as you fought him on the brink of death. A boss battle of sorts would commence, ending with you killing Nawali and at long last having Santo Ileso as your own. So how that turned into this crap is beyond me. Jesus Christ! I'm still blown away by how everything I was shown turned into this abhorrent story seen in the full game. Like, even knowing a new cast was going to be implemented, the story beat still seems solid. If they didn't write the Saints to be shitty millennial stereotypes, drop the perspective of the rival gangs, turn Nawali into some piss-pants loser who wanted friends even though he clearly became friends with the Saints, drop the importance of the Codex, and kept the LARPers as a one-off joke, the story would have been fine. It probably would have ranked somewhere between Saints Row 1 and 2. From my understanding, many of the more baffling story changes happened during the pandemic. As Jarus' contract expired, he left some final notes for the writing team and they did their best to fulfill his wishes. Apparently, after the new cast was finalized, Jarus demanded their introduction had to play out like a sitcom. So yeah, the most horrific cutscene that plunges the game's entire story in the trash was Jarus' great idea.
That's so bad, it's good.
That's
it's just
a big
good. And like
bitch.
this idea of like we can't have entertainment just be entertainment. We can't have something light and fluffy and fun and enjoy it for what it is.
I didn't even know you could do it.
You almost have to wonder if he is purposely sabotaging the company. But okay, to be fair to Steve, the writers not being allowed to talk to him went both ways. From my understanding, it was the fear of a third rejection that the higher-ups write into his contract as work couldn't be contested. He reached out to the writers after the reboot's release, sharing his grief that he wasn't authorized to workshop with them. See, Jarus in a lot of ways is like George Lucas. Both are capable of bringing interesting concepts to life, but when they're surrounded by yes-men with nothing being questioned, they quickly fumble the ball.
I may have gone too far in a few places.
There was only one thing anyone was able to change about Jarus' script, and it took the protest of the entire studio to do it. Originally, Nina was going to be written as a dumb bimbo that all the other characters would walk over.
Oh my god, I'm so stupid.
It was so bad that the entire studio demanded the higher-ups give Steve notes, and Nina was changed into the art student we have today. Yeah, it's not much better, but at least she has a twinkle of depth. You're also probably wondering how any of this was possible when they had the 2080 rule in place. Well, sometime in late 2019, the rule was changed. Instead of being 80% Saints Row 2 and 20% Saints Row the Third, it evolved into 80% grounded and 20% silly. Later, it was changed again to 20% silly, 80% grounded, and 10% absurd. And yes, they were well aware that the math didn't add up. This was done so more outlandish ideas could be added, like the hoverboard. The last nail in the story's coffin comes down to the dialogue and voiceovers. THQ Nordic and Deep Silver, being the pinnacles of intelligence, put heavy restrictions on the writers for what the characters were allowed to say. In an M-rated game, an example I was given was the boss's rant after Gwen refuses to give them a performance bonus. The writers were told the boss could not say anything negative about Gwen, and she especially could not be called a bitch. Even if the lines were written for the female boss, it'd be far too misogynistic. So after multiple attempts that the publisher immediately shot down, do you know what they compromised with? The fucking horse testes rant!
Giant, sweaty, dangling horse testes just swinging in the goddamn breeze, knocking back and forth like a pair of motherfucking clappers in a giant horse flesh crotch bell!
Absolutely wonderful. A line so despised by the entire gaming community that it was later removed in an update. Thanks, THQ. Thank you, Deep Silver. My whole life would have been shattered if I heard a woman in a mature-rated Saints Row game being called a no-no word.
Bitch. That bitch, you bitch. I'm gonna skull fuck that bitch. Bitch.
Fine, bitches. You fucking bitch. Bitch is dead. Kill this bitch. Yeah.
I used to dig this bitch.
Bitch!
Bitch! Bitch! Ah!
Oh, and for that putrid ending with Love Shack, the writers hated it. The idea came very late into development. In fact, if you play the game without the day one patch, it isn't even there. A producer simply felt they needed an ending like Saints Row 4 and tied it into the reoccurring karaoke jokes in the story. So yeah, awesome. As for the voiceovers, normally the writers will sit in during a voice recording session to change things on the fly if something isn't coming across correctly. For the reboot though, the writers were not permitted to attend any of the voice sessions. Not a single one. As it was explained to me, two producers were in a dick swinging contest and it all accumulated in one of them displaying their authority by not allowing anyone to be present at the voice sessions. A move so petty that I still can't believe it. When you take all this into consideration, it's no wonder the story turned out like shit. But yeah, there you have part 1 to my 2019 visit to Volition. There is still an absurd amount to discuss and I'll be working as hard as possible to share it with you all soon. Until then, I just want to thank you all for reaching the end of this beast and for your incredible patience. Please tune in next time to learn how the game truly played 5 years ago, even more cut and altered features, the radically changed plans for the series' future, maybe a hint at where a sequel could have gone, and what was next for Volition before they were shut down. And oh man, you will not believe what they had cooking. Like always, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you guys next time. I already hate this.
Fuck, what is this?
Dustborn.
Oh god, it's got AJ's picture on it.
Oh my god, it did! Oh no! This is gonna be horrible.
Leave my friends alone. You're
Oh god!
These guys what
Get away from my friend!
We've been eating some scraps, Cyan meat. You've learned to
Holy
combine
shit.
talents. See, we shout. At these folks, not